I want to share some thoughts about Genesis 18. Usually on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we have a number of people always smaller than the first day, just like what I'm sure is on the screens right now. I don't get to see you, but I know that you are following in over here. But when we gather, we always have a conversation. I'm sorry we can't do that today. So instead, I'll just share some thoughts and reflections, going a little bit deeper into that section that we read in the Torah. If you look at Genesis 18, either on the sheet that I printed out for everybody, 18 starting at verse 16, or if you want to look into the Machzor, again I can tell you the page. It is on page 334. 334. There's a few things that are happening here that I think are really quite significant. First of all, God has made a decision to destroy these cities. We know them as Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? The text isn't explicit, but the rabbis are going to come in and make it very clear that there's a few different things that are happening. One of them is going to be the shedding of blood. There's lots of murder. There's crime and corruption. There's unfair practices in business. There is poor leadership in government. And people are really quite accepting of all of those things. But the thing that is captivating the rabbis the most is this rejection of hospitality. Earlier in Genesis, we see Abraham who performs a certain surgery on himself at the age, 99 years old, something that is kind of so foreign to ourselves. The next reading of the next Torah portion shows Abraham at the heat of the day, midday, when it's the hottest in the desert, and he is by the edge of his tent looking for strangers to welcome, feed, nourish, and take care of. In Sodom and Gomorrah, hospitality is against the law. And you have to think about, it's not just about being welcoming. We appreciate the idea of being welcoming, but hospitality in the Middle East, your life depended on it. Everybody's lives depended on it. So if you are going a little far from your tribe and you were vulnerable in the middle of a desert, people extended you hospitality, even if they didn't know you, even if you could be from another tribe. We have a little taste of that on our trips to Israel, our tours to Israel, where you might spend a little time in a Bedouin tent. They don't necessarily know any of us, and yet the hospitality is quite extraordinary from people who might not have much at all. Here, hospitality is against the law. And if you were to transgress that law, the types of punishments that are being described in our Midrash are so graphic, so heinous, so horrible. It is really clear illustrations of an evil society. And so after all of these different kinds of examples of evil, we see from the text that there is an outcry, a real calling out. But Robert Alter, a great Bible scholar, Dr. Alter describes this cry not as just a cry, but a shriek of torment. You have to understand what's happening in the city. Shrieks of torment. And that reaches God's ear and doesn't find them to be worthy. Abraham, in the text, stands before the eternal, but our rabbis have a certain explanation for what is really happening, and later scribes try to make an amendment to the Torah. It doesn't happen often, But it happens here because our text is often described having Abraham stand before God, but really it's God standing before Abraham. Can you imagine such a thing? God's trying to be answerable to Abraham, whom God respects. The other thing in the text in the very beginning is showing Abraham drawing near to God. And in this particular verb, you draw near for 3 different reasons. One is to enter into battle, one is to enter into prayer, and the other is to appease somebody else to try and make some sort of peace. Again, our classic commentator Rashi says, here what's happening is all 3. Abraham is gearing up to challenge God, is also prayerful that Abraham's own words would be able to sway God's own mind, so to speak, and to try and figure out how to make peace. Another piece of this, in verse 23, we see the word ha'af. In the Targum, in the Aramaic translation, we see that this is about anger. Rashi says, will your anger, God's anger, sweep away these cities? Could it be that we're seeing God lose God's cool, lose control over God's own emotions, and wants just to do away with these cities? I'm sharing these different pieces in the end that will show you a little bit of a thread. They're not just random ideas. So far we've talked a little bit about hospitality and welcoming others and keeping them safe. We talked about God hearing shrieks of torment. We talked about God showing deference to Abraham and how Abraham draws near, and the possibility of God losing control over God's own emotions. A great Jewish feminist thinker, Judith Plaskow, says, in the text it says, "Must not the judge of all the earth do justly?" That's what Abraham asked God. Will you indeed sweep away the innocent along with the wicked? And Plaskow says the implication of these questions is that the judge of all of the earth who creates the ethical norms that Abraham reflects back to God and is holding God answerable. The moral voice in the passage, while it all comes from God, is actually Abraham's voice. The power of the person here. Abraham isn't perfect, don't forget. We see that there are several times he wrongs his own wife, Sarah, a wife that he loves. But we are seeing Abraham holding God answerable and accountable. Reminds me of the mystical story of Tikkun Olam, of Tikkun, the repair of the world. In this incredible moment of creating, God creates this vessel, and the creation is so intense, it can't manage to stay there, and so it breaks apart. And there are these sparks of light that go all through the universe. But in order to create that one vessel, God has to contract God's own self in order to make room for something that's imperfect. God makes God's self smaller in order to create something imperfect, but filled with light. That's us. We are here imperfect, and maybe, just maybe, that's also represented in God. There's another piece of the story. Rabbi Harold Kushner teaches if a community can produce a subculture of righteous people, and if they involve themselves within the city trying to change it, then there's going to be hope for a community. It also reminds me, this teaching, that in verse 24, when we're talking about tzaddikim, these righteous people, in the plural, the word for tzaddikim, tzaddik, has a yud in it, and when it's a plural, there's going to be another yud. But the second yud is missing in the Torah's text. These are righteous people, but that second yud is missing. In Jewish tradition, the letter yud represents God's name, Yud, He, Vav, He. They are righteous, but don't have a sense of the divine in their lives. Maybe they aren't feeling the balance or grounded or centered, and so they are staying silent. Righteous people who stay silent. Does it mean that they're not really righteous? No. It means that they're afraid or that they're feeling siloed. Again, it reminds me of Noah, who puts on the coat just for himself. I have another short teaching about this before we make our connections. The founder of modern Orthodoxy is a rabbi named Samson Raphael Hirsch. And Rabbi Hirsch, from Germany, a rabbi who gets his PhD, he says something so surprising to me. He thinks personally, intimately. He cites how Abraham knows the nature of the righteous, since Abraham himself is righteous, and he knows how he would feel were he to stand in the place of an individual who merits to be saved from destruction and yet can't do anything about it. Rabbi Hirsch shares empathy. Empathy with the righteous in the city. And the last teacher is Burton Vizotsky from Jewish Theological Seminary. He wrote a book some years ago called The Genesis of Ethics. And in it, he notes that Abraham arguing with God is courageous and bold, but it's not too effective because all of the power is really held by God. Perhaps that is why he just agrees to pursue the binding of Isaac and doesn't protest the way he wants him to. But we can admire Abraham for trying even if God has all of the power. And this is persistence. This is resilience worth acknowledging. So after unpacking these different aspects of Abraham arguing with God in Genesis 18, why is it a model for Rosh Hashanah of beginning of the year anew? Abraham is a model here because there's injustice. And people are calling out and crying out from turmoil and pain and hardship. And Abraham isn't afraid for his life and is willing to hold God accountable. Abraham is expressing courage, and we're seeing examples of empathy and the persistence of advocating for justice, even if I know my argument isn't going to win the day. I think these are the themes that we need to be thinking of these days of awe. Hearing the cries of others, not leaving it up to God, opening up our hearts with hospitality and how we can save lives, holding God and each other accountable for our actions, digging down and finding that courage, having a sense of empathy, and the persistence of trying to do what's right. These themes are going to be returning to us again on Yom Kippur, but from the text of the Torah, we don't need more examples of how this should play out in our lives. What we should be doing It's self-evident. It is clear to us what this new year ought to inspire for us and how we need to respond. That's my teaching. That's my prayer this year. That's my hopes for all of us.